For the last 5 years, I've worked as an overnight security guard at a hospital. I've been working night security in various settings for about 12 years now, and before that, I was a Marine. I share this only to emphasize the point that I'm used to odd situations and bumps in the night. And while the hospital has had its share of weird stuff happen in the past, as many old buildings do, nothing has been over the top or considered too crazy. But tonight was different. Part of my job requirements include the nightly unlocking and patrol of a very old building located on the hospital's campus. This was one of the first buildings built in the city and is currently used as the College of Nursing. But at night, it's completely deserted. Around 3 a.m. this morning, the main hospital building sat peaceful and quiet, so I figured I'd head over to the old building to get the unlocks out of the way. I'm in this building a lot, mind you, probably 2 to 5 times each and every week for the last 5 years. I've gotten used to the creepiness, and honestly, I kinda like the quiet. But tonight, as I approached the building, I suddenly got a very odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. That feeling like I'm being watched by a predator. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows this feeling. Your hackles raise, so to speak, and your mind screams at you to get out of there immediately. I stopped outside the door and scanned the street behind me, as well as the courtyard I was standing in, but nothing obvious takes shape. I couldn't shake the feeling though. I willed myself to brush it off, quite unsuccessfully, but ultimately I decided that the job has to get done either way. So I unlocked the door and headed inside, then relocked the doors behind me and made a mental note to unlock these doors last. Inside, the feeling only got worse. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. I walked my usual route, inspecting each floor one by one, and the feeling continued to get worse as I moved closer to the older parts of the building. At this point, I had been all through the first floor, and all the entrances are locked tight, so I was absolutely sure I was the only one in the building. I then worked my way to the upper floors, and I started hearing things. Footsteps, maybe? It was hard to tell because whatever it was seemed to be matching the cadence of my own steps, but these sounded like hard-soled shoes, not the boots I was wearing. I quickly turned to inspect the halls, but I found nothing. Then a door slammed. The sound echoed from the hall I just left. My skin went cold. I sprinted towards the direction of the sound, and it only took a few seconds to reach the area, but nothing was there. I opened the door and entered, and I now stood in an old auditorium, holding my breath as I focused my senses, trying to detect any movement or sound. But there was nothing. At this point, my inner monologue began a vain attempt to explain the logic of this absurd situation. It had to be the pipes clicking in the aging basement, or maybe I simply missed a door being opened and it rattled closed as I walked by. Feeling satisfied with my pep talk, I continued on with my usual inspection. But despite the talk I just had with myself, I couldn't ignore the fact that the feeling that had first come over me when I approached the building was still here, and it was getting stronger with every step. I entered the stairs on the 4th floor, and I stopped for a second to breathe. I then took a minute to fidget with my phone, anything to distract me from the horror I felt in my gut. Suddenly, another door slammed shut, and as the echoes in the empty stairwell subsided, I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps raining a chorus of echoing terror on my ears from somewhere below me. I grabbed my radio and called dispatch and let them know that someone was in the building with me, but the device beeped at me, telling me the batteries were dead and that no calls would be going out. I sucked air through gritted teeth. Thankfully, my phone had plenty of battery and service. I dialed the number for the dispatch office. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. A bead of cold sweat ran past my ear. Then, the line clicked and one of the guys in the office answered. I breathed a hard sigh and explained the situation. Dispatch said they'd be sending guys over to assist. I breathed again. I ended the call and stood silent at the crest of the 4th floor stairs and listened for any sign of the intruder. But all was quiet. I heard no voices, no footsteps, no doors. What was worse, I heard no sounds at all. Not even a breeze outside the windows. I leaned out in front of me and glanced down the center of the stairwell, but I saw nothing, just layers of concrete stairs winding their way past 3 floors of unimaginable possibility. I began a slow descent to the bottom, and stopped every 10 or 15 steps to listen. I made it all the way to the bottom, and then made the climb back to the 4th floor, but heard nothing on the way. I started second-guessing myself, and had begun to prepare myself for all the jokes and jeers headed my way when the other security personnel arrived to find no one else in the building. I then decided just to suck it up and finish this last floor. Then I could work my way toward the entrance and meet up with the other guards. The click of the door made one final echo down the stairwell as I opened it, and I stepped into the 4th level of the building. I was immediately taken back by what I saw. Everything was different. Not different as in the atmosphere had changed, but what lay before me was an entirely different setting than what I'd seen from this exact spot so many nights in the past. The entire floor, which normally consisted of old offices used for storage and whatnot, was completely different. White painted walls now had wood paneling. All the clutter was gone and was replaced by outdated lab and medical equipment. Filing cabinets sat where poorly stacked boxes should have rested, but the strangest change of all was that at the end of the hall, 2 leather-bound chairs sat in each corner, and 2 men sat in them, talking to each other. They stopped and looked at me. I stood there in stunned silence, trying to force my brain to understand what I was seeing. Then I blinked, and it was all gone. Everything back to normal. The offices and white walls, the boxes, everything. I just couldn't understand it. 1 second, it was completely different from the hundreds of times I've stepped down to the floor, and the next, everything was the way it should be. Instinctively, I tried my radio again, but at the same moment I remembered the dead batteries, my finger found the button and pressed it, and it worked. A loud crackle of fuzz invited my voice, so I yelled into the receiver that I need units on 4 to help me search every office. Of course, everything was fine when the other guards arrived, and I was left standing there wondering what had just happened to me. As we finished checking the floor, I caught a wave of insults from the other guys. Then, after we finished the building, I went down to dispatch to check the camera feeds from each floor in the old building, desperate to find some answers. We rewound the recording to the timestamp that showed me opening the front door and entering. We hit play and watch as the door closed behind me, and then the feed froze entirely for about 8 seconds. Sure, not totally unusual, but certainly not exactly common for those cameras. Then the senior dispatcher, who had been working security at the hospital for decades, asked me what I had seen. I described it to him, and when I'd finished, he looked at me skeptically and said, "Weird." That's how it looked back in the 80s before they redid the lower floors, and those were all labs for the college. I was speechless. I decided to save myself from further embarrassment and told him I was probably just getting tired and seeing or hearing things. Deep down though, I knew that wasn't the case. I was wide awake and I knew exactly what I'd seen and heard throughout the entire inspection of that building. I just left his office and I'm outside having a smoke. I don't know how to explain this. Everyone has had weird experiences in that old building at one point or another, but this one was so real, so vivid, that I honestly don't know if I'll ever be the same. At one point in my life, I was a complete non-believer in the paranormal or supernatural, but when I was 13, my naive brain would be put in its place. It was the summer of 2007. Life was good. I had a fairly normal teenage life, which consisted of a few friends my age who lived in the same neighborhood, and we would do a lot of outdoor activities like hiking, mountain biking, and fishing. We lived just north of the Ozark Mountains in a nice little town in Arkansas. My father had worked very hard to give us all a good life. He came from a poor family and joined the military at 18 to better his future, and it paid off. He got a good job working on airplanes, and we moved into a nice old house that my parents had gotten at a great deal. The village was a nice little community built into the woods. There were golf courses, private lakes and trails, and it even had its own shopping center with several stores and restaurants. We were a happy, normal, middle-class family. That is, until that thing showed up and ruined our lives. Growing up, I'd heard a lot of local legends about the natives that used to inhabit the area. Supposedly, our entire community was built on top of sacred land. I used to walk the trails near my house a lot, and it was common to find cliffs and overhangs with Native American paintings on the walls, remnants of their civilization. I always felt bad about how they were driven from their homes by my ancestors, but I was still grateful for my home and my wonderful life. The kids at school would often try to scare each other by telling tales of shamans and summoned skinwalkers, and how they still haunted the woods at night, but I always laughed it off. Ghosts and monsters aren't real, they're just made up to scare kids, right? I always thought those ghost hunter shows were ridiculous. You wouldn't hear or see anything on camera, but the people in the show would jump out of their boots at a simple creak in the night, cue the suspenseful music as the cameras focused on empty darkness. Sure, these shows are fun for the imagination, but the reality of paranormal entities is much more terrifying. They can tear apart families and bring your whole world crashing down. One summer night, I would get first-hand experience on how severe the outcome of that dark reality can be. The air was cool that night. I had my window open and I could hear the wind blowing through the leaves as cicadas reverberated through the midnight woods, coercing me towards a sleepy trance. Fully relaxed, I head off towards sleep. I was in my peaceful place, completely safe. Then, in that moment between sleep and consciousness, a wave of panic rolled over me. Every hair on my body stood on end as chills sped up and down my spine. I felt the eyes of someone or something on me. I could feel their sinister intent. Every bit of me begged my brain to run. I could sense that something in the shadows wanted to kill me, or worse, wanted to own me, to see me suffer. It watched me in the moment, watched me struggle, and I couldn't breathe. I squeaked out a raspy, "Help me! Help me!" And then my voice returned, and I screamed for my mother. I heard my echoes of panic mix with the strangest laughter I'd ever heard. It wasn't human, not a physical voice, multiple voices of differing octaves all laughing at once. I was now unable to open my eyes, and in the blackness I could see its eyes, blue and bloodshot, bulging with huge pupils. I wanted to scream, but once again my voice was captive. I gasped as I woke. My breathing was shallow and sharp, and I sat up, rubbing tears from my eyes, and then I opened them and froze. Through my open bedroom door, I could see something lying on our living room couch. It was clearly visible, but it wasn't a person. It was more like a shadow, flowing and illuminated by moonlight with the same blue eyes from my dream. It was staring at me, with a smile so sinister I find it hard to describe. I sat there in my bed, still frozen with fear. I felt electricity coursing through my body and up into my brain. My eyes were wide and watering, and the shadow stared at me for what felt like hours. Then, in an instant, it shifted out of sight, darting down the couch and into the shadows. Adrenaline hit me and I flung myself out of bed and sprinted into my parents' room. I burst through the door panting, covered in sweat. But as I described the details of my encounter, and when they saw how terrified I was, the unease and the fear crept their way into my father's eyes. He believed me, and he was scared. You see, my father was a devout Christian and fully believed in demons. He was convinced that I had just been tormented and that I was in danger. He was very serious, and I could see how disturbed he was by what had just happened. He woke my younger sister up and the entire family gathered in the living room. And while he meant well, I truly wish my dad had never done what he did next. He got his Bible and turned the pages until he found the specific verse he was looking for. I don't quite remember the actual verse, but it was something about casting out demons. "In the name of Jesus Christ," he said, "I command you to leave my family alone." He yelled the command angrily, cursing the demon. "If you want one of us, take me. Leave my family alone." He repeated the last part, emphasizing his authority and protection over us. We sat in the living room, talking well into the night. After a while, we were all painfully tired and went back to bed. But understandably, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't forget those eyes, and the way it moved. Such a disturbing thing. The next few months passed, and life proved to be back to normal. My sister and I went back to school, and for the most part, I had forgotten all about the demon. I even convinced myself it was all a bad dream, or even sleep paralysis, even though that would have been the only time I had ever experienced such a thing. But then, out of nowhere, my dad was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer, and it had spread. He was dying. My family was devastated. That day after we'd heard the news, I hugged my father and cried nearly the entire day. I couldn't believe it was happening. I was losing my dad. He was always so strong and seemed very healthy. What puzzled the doctors was that his form of cancer was almost always found only in teenage boys, nearly 100% of the time. I was consumed with guilt when I heard this. The entire experience with the demon came back to me at once, and I remembered my father's words to the demon. And I'm certain that it had its eyes on me, but went after my dad instead. My father remained positive through his sickness. He went to chemo sessions and started eating healthier and exercised as much as he could. He lived for 3 more years, even though the doctors said he had less than a year to live. But what disturbs me to this day is that near the end, when my dad started to deteriorate physically and mentally, he began to resemble the demon. He was so thin he looked like a skeleton, and his blue eyes seemed to become brighter. Sometimes he would look at me from the couch and I would immediately get chills. The demon had been mocking me, showing me his power and what he had done to my father, all with a smile, as if this was a joke. When my dad died, our family was broken. My mother fell into a deep depression. I looked after my sister as best I could, but I was a poor substitute for a real father figure. We fell behind on the bills and the bank foreclosed on our house. We lost everything. The years have been a struggle, but I'm now an adult with a somewhat normal life. I visited my sister not long ago, and she and I got to talking about ghosts and the paranormal. I asked if she'd ever seen anything like that, and after hesitating for a bit, she finally answered. And what she said horrified me. She was very young the night I saw the demon, and she had largely forgotten about that night, but she told me that some nights she would wake up to see a shadowy man at the end of her bed. She said he moved like black water, and that he had bright blue eyes. My family and I have moved a lot throughout my life, and nothing strange has ever really happened in all the places I've lived. But all that changed with our most recent move. My family had built a house in the middle of the woods on a mountain that overlooked the valley below us. It's a beautiful scene, and to this day I will often go and admire the view. The entire house is adorned with huge windows, a specific request of my parents, so we could all enjoy the scenery and get plenty of natural light. And while nature is nothing short of beautiful during the day, the pitch black of night often left me feeling uneasy at best. A few months after we moved, my parents were out for a few hours, leaving my 3 siblings and me at home, alone. The afternoon was going smoothly and was turning out to be an ordinary Wednesday. Later that night, we all piled in the car and started the drive to our weekly church activity. My 18-year-old brother stayed behind because he was too old to go to the youth activities at church, but about 10 minutes into our drive, he called my older sister. My brother is infamous for his no-nonsense attitude. It had always taken a lot to intimidate him, which is understandable considering his 6'3" stocky frame. My sister answered his call and put it on speaker, and my brother proceeded to ask us if we had left yet. The 3 of us looked around at each other confused. My sister responded that we had left a while ago, and that we were already almost at the church. My brother paused again for a moment, and when he spoke again, he asked if our youngest sister was in the car. Once again, we told him we were all here in the car, and I asked him if something was wrong, and in the calmest voice, my brother proceeded to tell us what had happened, and to this day, I'm surprised at how unbothered he seemed. My brother's room was one of the biggest rooms in the house, as it was a game room that took up half the upstairs. He was playing a game on his Xbox when he heard the sound of muffled talking downstairs. This left him confused, considering the fact that he was sure that we had already left, but he quickly shrugged it off, and after a few more seconds he had the sudden urge to check out the noise. His door opened up to the top of the stairs, and a wall blocked the view of the kitchen, which means he couldn't see into it from where he was standing. He told us that the voice sounded like a little girl's, and he assumed it was my youngest sister talking to the dogs. He couldn't understand what she was saying since the voice was too muffled for him to hear, which was strange considering my sister is very loud. He called her name, but there was no answer. The muffled talking continued. Frustrated by the lack of response, he called her name again, this time much more forcefully, and then made his way downstairs. When he was about halfway down the steps, he heard the sound of bare footsteps running across our hardwood floor, heading into our parents' room. He continued down the steps and rounded the corner and found no one. Just our 2 dogs, a golden retriever and a German shepherd, who sat staring at the area where my brother thought he had heard the footsteps. He looked around the house, but found no trace of anyone. He then went from room to room calling our names multiple times. He was sure we were pranking him, and that's when he called our phones. I was unnerved when he finished his story and asked him if he was messing with us. He swore he wasn't and he hung up. Frankly, I don't believe in the supernatural, and if my brother wasn't messing with us, I was concerned that there was someone actually living in our house and we weren't aware. When we arrived home from the church event, my brother had already told our parents what had happened, and they immediately set off towards my parents' closet to inspect. Inside my parents' closet was a fairly large crawl space hidden behind a panel in the closet's wall, so it would make sense that someone would run into their room if this is where they were hiding. But no one was in there. We were all a little freaked out, but after a few weeks of no other occurrences, we simply forgot about it. Over the next year, no one else experienced anything significant, other than the occasional doors opening and closing by themselves, but I was always quick to blame this on the drafty house. It was now nearing the end of the school year, and summer was almost upon us. My 2 closest friends had saved up enough money over the school year to fly to my state and visit me for a couple weeks. I was ecstatic about seeing them again. One night we planned a sleepover, and we were all in my room getting ready to sleep. At the time, I shared a room with my sister, so we had 2 twin beds in there. My sister slept with my parents, and each of my friends took a bed while I spread a blanket out on the floor. We sat talking into the late hours of the night when suddenly we heard tapping. The conversation quickly stopped and my two friends were obviously freaked out. I laughed when I saw their expressions and made a joke about it being a ghost, but they were less than thrilled about this as they both believed in the paranormal. They decided they'd search my room in an attempt to find the source of the noise. With my curiosity piqued, and due to the fact that I'd never heard this noise in my room before, I helped them search. After a few minutes of looking, we closed in on the sound and found that it was coming from the far left corner of my room, and then the sound stopped. My friends elected me to be what they called the investigator. They told me to try to replicate the noise by tapping on various objects around my room, and over the next few minutes I would hit, tap, and move many objects, but none of them made a sound even close to the tapping we'd heard before. Then one friend suggested I try the wall, which I did, and to the surprise of all of us, it was an exact match to the sound. At this realization, both friends became visibly upset. I crossed the room to console them, and then it dawned on me. This was probably my sister pranking us. I turned and ran out the room and into the bathroom that sat on the other side of the wall, but my sister wasn't there. I ran out of the bathroom and headed down the stairs, thinking that would have been the quickest escape route for her. Sure enough, I found her on the couch, but there were no signs that she had recently moved. One of the dogs laid next to her as she watched a show on her phone, petting him affectionately. I interrogated her about the tapping noises, but the only thing I got in return was a puzzled look, followed immediately by another look that asked, "Are you going crazy?" Honestly, in that moment, I wasn't sure. I returned to my room and found my friends sitting on the floor next to each other. I tried to lighten the mood by saying that if it was a ghost, maybe it was trying to communicate with us. I sat on my bed and pressed against the wall, joking that perhaps it was speaking in Morse code. And immediately after I said that, the tapping started again, this time louder. One friend buried her head in her hands, and the other let out an audible squeal. Both of them were more afraid than I'd ever seen them. I was still unbothered though, and continued to mess around. "If there is someone here," I said, "tap the wall faster." The second the words left my mouth, the tapping sped up. We froze, and then my friends screamed and rushed out of my room down the stairs. I quickly followed them, not sure what to think about it all. I tried to play it off like it was a coincidence, but they weren't buying it, and at this point, a small part of me wasn't buying it either. We stayed in my living room for a couple hours until I stood and announced that I was going to bed, ghost or not. At first, my friends didn't want to come back upstairs with me, but I said that if the spirit wanted to murder me, it would have done so a long time ago. The three of us went back to my room, and the two of them shared the bed far away from the wall while I slept on the floor. We heard no more tapping that night, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, my friends were even more afraid than they were the night before. Finally, after some prodding, I was able to get them to tell me what they were so upset about, and to this day, I still don't know if I believe what they told me. According to them, in the early hours of the morning, both of them still hadn't fallen asleep. They said they were simply too scared. At one point, they said my closet door slowly opened and then closed, and apparently this continued the rest of the night, and neither of them dared move. Then, a shadowed hand appeared in the window, and this was when they said they had woken me up, but I don't remember being woken by them. They said they'd told me everything they'd seen, but I simply yawned and said, "Don't worry, the demon will eat me first," and then I fell back to sleep. They finished their story and I sat in quiet disbelief. A large part of me was sure they were running on overload from the night before and the paranoia had gone to their heads. I wasn't sure what to say though. There were so many unanswered questions. We had breakfast and they returned to their hotel. They claimed my house was haunted and they had no desire to sleep there again. But I haven't had any issues in my room since, other than the occasional feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes other things will happen in the house though. Strange noises or the sudden feeling that someone is behind me. I truly wonder if my friends saw something that night, or if they were just too scared and tired to know what they were seeing. All I know is I heard the tapping, and I'm not sure if it's too much of a stretch to believe that there was something in my house that night.